preparing our reflections on how disability inclusion connects with and can even inform principles of mission, evangelism, and discipleship, I kept running into a perhaps unexpected topic that I think deserves its own focus. More than anything, this is the stuff that I wish I'd known about starting off in mission. I'm thinking about design or design thinking. What? What does that even mean? All right, well, first, I'm going to assume that most of you are not going into mission primarily to do disability ministry, and that's fine. This module is not intended to get you to rethink any of that. But what we do want, though, is to get issues of inclusion and exclusion before you in a particular way, with the desire that you will approach your service and your growth in it with a bit of a broader horizon. All right, design. See, if you're in church or outreach ministry of any kind, you're doing design work, whether or not you're getting paid for it or even aware of it. Anything you do, any gathering you organize, any presentation you make that isn't fully scripted out in advance, inescapably involves designing spaces, interactions, environments, maybe even buildings to achieve your particular ends. So here's the first problem we run into. It seems inevitable that we will all gravitate toward a standard design approach. That's certainly what we see modeled for us in both the church and the marketplace. Now, by standard design, I mean designing for the norm. You set up a building, a space, a meeting, a product, so that it's normally usable by normal people in normal conditions. Nothing special, nothing fancy, just regular stuff for regular folks. No need to overthink that, right? I mean, it is because this sort of designing to the norm is both so sensible and seemingly practical that we don't even see it as being design. It seems more like just using common sense or being realistic or making do with what you have. Designing to the norm does come quite naturally, and the more that our congregations and gatherings reflect a look that is more homogeneous than diverse, I'm thinking here in terms of ability, but you could talk about ethnicity or economic class or theological dogma as well. The more that look is homogeneous, the more likely it is that we're going to take a standard design approach. In other words, if all of us look, read, speak, act, spend pretty much like me, then when we reach out to them, we are already predisposed to assume that they, whoever they are, will or should become more or less like us in some significant respects. We've also got this thing about productivity. We evaluate return on investment, and your mission probably is going to evaluate return on ministry investment. And that can foster pragmatism and prioritize measures of effectiveness or efficiency. You seek to reach the most people with the best spiritual goods and services with the least unit effort or cost. Well, one side effect of this approach is that it inevitably breaks people down into categories of hard and easy, with easy being more like us, meaning that including them would require considerably less of us. It's not hard to see that as privileging our own experience, our own status. We normalize the privilege of being able, and then as a result, we're no longer able to see it as a privilege. This is where ableism comes from. We establish ourselves as normal, and having done so, what works for us works, period. We don't even bring others into view because they are by definition exceptions. We can become quite invested at actually keeping those others out of view. And we allow or perpetuate structures that keep us from truly engaging others. As my friend Tanya, who uses a wheelchair, says, for most people in town, it's nothing. What's nothing? She's referring to stepping 2-3 steps up to a building, to get into the courtroom, to get into the school, to get into the church. My friend Tanya uses a wheelchair, and she says, for most people in town, it's nothing. They don't even notice it. For me, it's as significant as if someone put Mount Everest right in front of me. We don't really understand the world that these other people are living in. But the disability is not a function of functional limitation or loss of the level of the individual. Tanya's problem wasn't in her legs. It was in the steps. Impairment and limitation are indeed inescapably personal experiences, but the disability occurs when someone with particular limitations or impairments interacts with an environment or activity that's created or controlled that could be made accessible but isn't. And those who create and perpetuate social environments could include people with a greater variety of ages and abilities, for example, by making reasonable accommodations for people who couldn't otherwise participate. But to get ahead of the need to make accommodations, we could also apply principles of what's called universal design. Universal design means simply designing things, whether they're products, buildings, exterior spaces, experiences, to be usable and accessible by all people to the greatest extent possible. This kind of design thinking helps us to consider a wider range of human variation as we create media, spaces, programs, sermons. Here's the challenging part. When it's in our power to apply universal design or to make reasonable accommodations, and we fail to do so, we're probably committing disability discrimination. And in a letter that addresses discrimination directly, James writes, "So then, if you know the good you ought to do and don't do it, you sin." That's the element that makes it personal, serious, back from scary. This is an issue of our own holiness here, folks. So, future mission workers, do you appreciate how much and how often you will actually be functioning as a designer? Think about these questions. Will you plan regular or irregular meetings or gatherings? What will happen in them? Where will you meet? How will you gather? What do you do when you do gather? If you're not following a set of instructions, you're designing the environment, the space, the program, the interaction. What kind of program, if any, will you use? What sort of materials will be made available? And in what format? How do people access the meeting space? How's that space set up? What is demanded of those who attend in order to fully participate? How much of the presentation is narrative, personal, interactive? How much is conceptual and objective? How is the gospel understood and presented? These are questions that you don't have the answers to at the beginning. This is what these questions describe the design process that every gospel minister engages in, whether or not it's done well, whether or not it's done consciously. Well, so if nothing else, you've picked up a new credential from this here talk. You're a designer. Now, I think you know where we're going to go when we put universal access and you're a designer together. How do we design our churches, our meetings, our outreaches? Because you can count on God always being on the move. He's always inviting more people to the banquet table that Jesus has set. So what's going to happen when we encounter people or situations that fall outside this norm for which we've pretty much instinctively designed our programs or buildings or environments or churches or missions? At best, we might decide to make accommodations to make the inaccessible accessible. Now that's a good thing. It brings about good not only for the ones that have been previously left out and now they're not, but it's good for the whole body, because now it more visibly reflects its true identity. But making changes like that can be costly, and not only in dollars and cents to actually pay for actual concrete changes, but change can bring confusion, even frustration. Anytime there's a status quo, those who have benefited from a prior position of privilege within it, whether knowingly or unknowingly, whether they believe it or not, they might feel slighted or resentful over what they feel they've lost or are losing. Actually, bringing diverse people together can engender fear or suspicion, maybe even shame. I've seen it. So some fellowships just decide the costs are just too high and they're not making them. After all, this place already works fine for most people. Actually, it works fine for all of us. So we turn away, and over time, ableism gains a foothold. And ableism is just as deeply entrenched and just as difficult to unroot and unlearn as our racism and sexism. Many of us don't want to think or even talk about disability. Some of us are already actively denying our own hidden impairments, including hearing or vision loss, learning difficulties, frailty, pain, mental struggles. And we don't know what resources are or could be available or how to ask for them or who to ask. But the Great Commission on which we've been sent is not about finding the most efficient means for reaching the most people with the most important bits of the gospel. It's about taking the good news to everyone and loving one another in the process. So that's why we have to do better. So maybe you'll start a church. Maybe you'll connect in some effort with one or more local churches. And the church is probably going to have something, and it might even be an actual sign or a slogan that says, "Everybody welcome." An unreflective approach to disability in church would be to hang that welcome sign out, because it does reflect our heart, and then wait until a person with a disability arrives and decide how to respond and what welcome would look like. That's pretty normal. But think about what that communicates. Doesn't it send a signal to people with disabilities that they're more a burden than anything? A burden that needs to be accommodated rather than a potentially integral part of the church community? Where universal design is considered optional, frankly it pretty much always is, when it is within our ability to design and accomplish something in a universally accessible manner, and we don't do so, that means it is by definition not universally accessible, and again by definition it means that it is exclusionary by design, even if not by intent. But the exclusion is just as strong and just as real and just as effective and just as painful as it would be as if it were intentional. So when we're thinking about the church, we have to ask, why would a movement grounded in and on a mission to reach all people develop default assumptions that are exclusionary by design? There is a natural inclination to use yourself as a shortcut to make assumptions about the people you're designing for. And that's reinforced by the pervasive influence of this shape, the bell curve. Though designed to describe mathematical distribution of a range of natural items, when it was applied, or I should say misapplied, to social sciences, it led to this whole way of seeing and conceptualizing diversity and variations in human beings as degrees of error from an ideal or perfection. This bell curve mindset convinces us incorrectly that the benefit to the church from disability will be minimal. Accessibility is treated as an extreme form of otherwise normal design. But here's the fun part. If that bell curve is not correct, and there is no such thing as a truly normal user, then there's also no extreme user. There is no such thing as people that fall on the edges of the curve. There's no abnormal scenario. There is no edge case. There are no fringe populations. What we need are new tools to represent human diversity and challenge our entrenched habit of designing and evangelizing and planning churches for the average. We in ministry often underappreciate the creative leverage we have as designers, partly because we regular folks are so steeped in that standard design, designing to the norm, that we don't even see that it is design. Universal design thinking suggests a different approach, designing with disability in mind. Instead of thinking, what will be helpful for most people, what if we approach designing asking, how can this be used or accessed by everyone, particularly those who can't make use of the regular option, So this would mean we would want input from people with disabilities, specific design input at the beginning stages of our ministry design. So, if at the early stages of your ministry launch you realize you don't have access to input from anyone dealing with disability, you might want to consider broadening your social circle because you really need them at this phase. Actually, being called indispensable by Paul, it's safe to say that we need people with disabilities in our fellowships at every phase. So this process is teaching us some important things already. People with disabilities, they deal with a lot of tough stuff, but they also experience the world in a unique way. And their unique experiences can help us make and design churches and ministries that will be better for everyone, both for people with and without disabilities. Here's the leverage point. When we look at how universal design has been employed, we notice that it develops solutions for people with disabilities, but that these solutions end up being normalized and embraced and loved by the mainstream, their roots in disability notwithstanding. Consider the case of those OXO potato peelers. Now, check that out. It was originally designed for people with mobility issues, things like arthritis. It could not use the standard peeler. But it was so comfortable, everybody loved it. Nobody wants to use those old ones anymore. Electronics manufacturers used universal design to consider how deaf persons could make better use of the communication technology they were developing. What was the output? Text messaging. Now, I don't see anybody out there saying we don't do that text stuff because it was designed for other people with impairments. The cuts on the curbs, which were made for people with wheelchairs. Man, moms with strollers like it. People with sore feet like it. It works. It's really better for everybody. Those ramps really pay off for everybody, even though they were only designed to make something accessible for somebody that had been left out. So, what's our mindset as church planners and disciple makers, particularly as designers of ministry spaces and environments? What if we designed for disability first, instead of designing to the norm? Might we find that in the ministry sphere as well? When we design for disability first, we stumble on some solutions and approaches that are not only more inclusive, but might even turn out to be better than what we would come up with designing for the norm. I think this could really be a game changer for local congregations. Instead of seeing the energy that it takes to accommodate somebody with a disability as a cost, we can see it as something that with God's help can be leveraged and molded and played with as a force for creativity and innovation. So, fellow designers, please be attentive from the very beginnings to how church spaces, buildings, gatherings, community interactions, programs like curriculum, etc., can be designed to be usable by all people to the greatest possible extent. And from the start, keep in mind that disability is not a special condition of a few edge cases, that it's ordinary and it affects most of us for at least some part of our lives. And grasping the reality that if a design or a church works well for people with disabilities, it's probably going to work better for everyone. So what's really happening here is we're reframing the question of what constitutes normality. What's the normal way to be mobile over the distance of a mile? Is it to walk? Drive my car? Take a taxi? Ride a bike? Use a wheelchair? Roller skate? Skateboard? Take the what? Recognizing that most people will experience some form of disability, whether permanent or temporary, over the course of their lives, let's just accept it and expect it. And allow that to open our imaginations to rethink and revision how we're going to design our churches. And then disability wouldn't seem so abnormal. Specifically addressing church design. What's the normal way to worship God in community? What's the normal way people, families, and communities are formed according to the image of Christ? What's the normal way to attend church, to participate in the spiritual and social life of the community? What's the normal way to belong to the body of Christ, to find and exercise your gifts? Is it normal for people experiencing disability to not have normal means to access Christian community? If our practice of church is mostly with normal folks like us, we might need to be reminded that just like users of appliances don't come in a standard format, church attenders and believers don't come in a standard format either. When we think or act as if we actually do reflect such a standard format, we're close to slipping into ableism, because our standard format before God is universal. We bear the image of the eternal. All of us are alienated from ourselves, from each other, from God's world, and from God due to our sin. The church exists to give voice to the gospel by enacting it in community. The gospel is a message of universal access. Mission exists because of the conviction that every person should have access to the saving knowledge of God in Christ. And that salvation is open to all. The message itself is one of universal access. Consider that God may desire his church to be accessible to all whom he calls. Universal design in the church starts with designing our buildings, our meetings, and our communities around that common reality. Not asking, how do we most effectively reach most people? But what would a house of prayer for all people look like in this community?